As Arpit mentioned, my name is Jill Lovato. I am with the Linux Foundation. I'm going to be moderating this morning's panel. And our distinguished panelists will give you another quick introduction. I will let them introduce themselves. I know Arpit kind of teed this up for us. So Chetan, if you want to go ahead and give us a lowdown on your expertise.
Thank you. Thanks, Arpit and Jill, for having me here. It's my hometown, so welcome to Seattle. So we have been doing strategy consulting. I've been in the wireless space for 30 years. I've been doing strategy consulting work in the space for about 20. And we primarily focus on things that are likely to be on the horizon, kind of 5-10 year horizon. So we can help the boards and senior management teams to figure out their strategy, product and technology strategy going forward. The areas that we focus on are 5G, edge computing, and more important, and a bunch of other things, but more importantly, how the intersections of these technologies drive disruption. So our thesis is that the synchronous S-curves changes the dimension of disruption by a significant factor, which is what we saw in the last 10 years because of smartphones, cloud, and LTE broadband. And we can go deeper into that as time allows. Thanks.
Awesome. I guess I'm next. So Will Townsend. I manage the networking and security practices for my firm, More Insights and Strategy. The firm has been around for about a decade. And what's really unique about our firm is that the average analyst on staff has over 30 years of industry experience. And little grayer, little less hair on the top of the head there, but I've spent my career in tech, started at Dell, interestingly got introduced to mobile broadband when I managed the relationship between Dell and TELUS and AT&T. So we were activating mobile broadband connectivity on the Latitude business notebooks, and that's how I got my first foray into cellular technology in general and telecom. A friend and my brother started a WiMAX firm initiative that I consulted with as well, and that was quite interesting. But I'm very passionate. I've been focused on this technology for quite some time, and just the power of connectivity and how it can drive social inclusion and economic prosperity. The digital divide is a very passionate topic for me. Pardon me there. I'm actually writing my first book called The Human Network. And unfortunately, the travel was delayed because of the pandemic. But I'm happy to say that I have the travel scheduled for next year. I'm going to travel to 4 different parts of the world. I'm going to be on the African continent for about 2 weeks with Cisco. And I'm also planning to be in the Amazon region. Personally, I have a connection to the Amazon in Brazil. My father was born on the banks of the Amazon River, moved here as a child. And I'll also be spending time with another infrastructure provider in India. And then the fourth area will be rural America. And again, spending time chronicling how connectivity can bridge that digital divide gap. And I'm super excited about that. So the book is set to be published probably by the end of next year. And I'll just also mention too, I'm a frequent Forbes contributor. I'm very supportive of open standards and what the Linux Foundation is doing to drive the democratization of networking and security in general. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Roy?
And I'm Roy, not as illustrious career as both of these guys. I started on the vendor side, got my start in networking, writing ATM firmware on a Cisco 7000 router when ATM was hot. Now it's not, but that's okay. So I've always spent my time on the vendor side for the most part, running product management, running marketing. And then went to management consulting for a little bit and started. How I got in with Linux Foundation and open networking is started a small company originally called SDN Central on the side as part of management consulting. SDN Central became SDX Central, it became Software Defined Everything Central. And everything was the research arm under SDX Central, was SDX Central Research, which we spun out independently in 2018. So here I am on the analyst side. Never thought I'd be sitting on this side. I'm usually on the other side trying to figure out, how much of my budget I give Gartner or IDC. But here I am, and I'm playing the other role now, looking for budget to say, just give me the crumbs. You can pay your Gartner millions of dollars. I'm just looking for, tens of Ks, and I'm fine with that. But as a result of SDN Central and open networking, we were one of the first ones to cover that disaggregation, that openness in networking, along with NFV. And so we've been working with Linux Foundation and the other open source organizations in this for the last 10, 12 years now, actually. So since the beginning. So here I am.
Great, thank you all. Sounds like we have a really diverse set of perspectives here, so let's hope for a lively discussion. So with that, would love to hear a little bit about your predictions for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And feel free to, if you want to share perspectives that are maybe more specific to the CSP market, or if we want to talk more general carrier enterprise marketing. What's next? What's around the corner? Will, you want to kick this off for us?
Sure, you bet. So I'm probably going to state the obvious, but certainly the trend that we're seeing with disaggregation and leveraging of open standards is going to continue to accelerate. When you look at Open RAN and you look at what Rakuten has been doing in their market, what Reliance has been doing in India, and then what Dish is doing in the US, these are all greenfield, obviously, initiatives. But I recently spent time in London at another event, Total Telecom, and got to spend time with Vodafone. And Vodafone is really leading the charge in Europe with respect to adopting Open RAN and open source. And really, when I asked my fellow panelists what the most compelling aspect of leveraging open standards was all about, it was about innovation and driving innovation. Driving agility, being able to provision devices on networks faster, deploy networks faster, reduce CapEx and reduce OpEx. So I've always been, Jill and Arpit know this, I've always been, a firm supporter of the value of open standards and open source and what the Linux Foundation continues to do with its many projects and that sort of thing. So that might be stating the obvious, but I think one of the challenges that arises with the disaggregation of the radio access network is the integration challenge, right? And so the traditional infrastructure providers, the Ericssons, the Nokias, the Huaweis, the Samsungs of the world, charged, a tidy sum to do that. And I know this in spending time recently here in Seattle with John Saw at an analyst event that T-Mobile conducted. But at the same time, that's a challenge, but it's a monetization opportunity as well for systems integrators. And the one example that I like to point to, which is really disruptive, is what Rakuten is doing with its Symphony platform. And so they're drinking their own champagne, eating their own dog food with respect to developing these tools to deploy, their highly disaggregated network, initially LTE and now 5G. But then they're also taking that and marketing that to the broader community to monetize that. Now, time will tell if they can be successful as an integrator and as an operator. But from my perspective, it's really, really innovative. So those are just a few things, Jill. I don't want to hog the podium, with my esteemed colleagues here, but.
Yeah, what do you think, Chetan? What about RAN? Are they really going to be able to do it at the end of the day?
So maybe if I can address your first question around.
Sure, yep.
So if you think about kind of bigger picture, I tend to think in terms of long cycles, which is a 20, 30-year cycle of what disruption might be taking place. And so if you look at kind of the last telecom and internet cycle, we propose that we are into a connected intelligence era where sensors and software are going to drive next 20, 30 years. And I think we are well into that cycle, and transformation is taking place at a rapid pace. That's kind of the 50,000-foot view. The next 20, 30 years will be driven by sensors and software. And there's a lot of complexity in how that comes together, but it's transforming every industry. Kind of if you come down to, say, maybe a 5,000 level view of what's happening in the telecom industry, I think it's driven by what we call the fourth wave of disruption. And that is essentially, if you look at the revenue streams of voice, messaging, and data, they have been growing, but peaking and coming down. And so bulk of the telco growth is going to come from the fourth wave of services or digital services. And that is happening. And so operators who invested heavily in that space in the LTE cycle are the ones who are better placed in the 5G cycle, and the ones that didn't will have a tougher time in the 5G cycle. Now you come down to the next level of, okay, what's happening in the, how do you achieve proficiency in the digital cycle or the fourth wave cycle? That's when things like Open RAN come into play. And the reason is that you cannot go from 4G cycle to 5G cycle with the same OpEx. Yeah, you can reduce your CapEx budgets, but if you're operating your business largely the same way you did in the 4G cycle, you won't have enough budget to deploy for new revenue streams. And that's where the growth is going to come from. So what we are seeing right now in the marketplace is as expected. The initial ARPU bump is through the premium services or the premium pricing that operators have. And so, but within 12 to 18 to 24 months, that will peak and taper off. And so the only growth left is going to be in the digital services. And to do that effectively, you have to deploy cheaper infrastructure, a more agile infrastructure that lets you launch services like an IT infrastructure, not like a traditional telco infrastructure. And that's when Open RAN and all the open source activities that are taking place allow you to deploy it rapidly and do it much at a lower cost. And so I think that's already happening in bits and pieces, and depending on the geography. And I'm quite optimistic that eventually everybody strategically will land on the same place, because you cannot go into a new cycle with the same OpEx mindset.
Yeah. Roy, what do you think? Do you agree with Chetan?
I always agree with Chetan. and Will, exactly, see, right? So, no, I do agree. I think, in terms of the trends that are shaping at a macro level, I think what Chetan talked about is absolutely right? That data, the ability to monetize data, use data, gather data for insights, which is where AI, ML come in some sense, right? That's important. The automation element is important, down to the reduction in the OpEx, which turns out to be key. I mean, CapEx is one piece of it, right? There's aggregation, white box, and drive that, but the OpEx is that as well. But along with that, at a macro level, the geopolitics, the supply chain, diversification of supply chain, the world order changing again, right? I think that we see as some of the trends that will drive some of the elements. And then at the micro level, when we talk to enterprises and carriers, what they sort of break down the impacts that they have into, I would say, sort of 5 buckets, right? There's the agility bucket, where, how do I become more agile? And that's hiring people, taking a DevOps mindset, right? How do you do that? So that trend, I think, doesn't go away. That automation framework, that automation mindset, or hyper automation, whatever that means, right? That's happening. And second one is actually, I would say stability. Given what's happening with impending recession, a lot of them are sort of hunkering down, trying to figure out how to protect that bucket of budget that they have, and the financing options that are increasingly dwindling, and how to maintain its stability and manage people accordingly, right? That's that. And then the third one I see is sort of resilience, right? How do you bounce back in events? That has been a theme for a lot of the companies that we work with. And then, there is the innovation, back to, I think what Will was saying. They're looking for ideas and areas around innovation, and open source. I totally agree with Will. Open source is definitely an element of that. It's also a recruitment tool, but it also allows you to drive innovation or do innovations on the back of others, right? So not reinvent the wheel, but look for new places to do innovation. And finally, we're seeing a lot of sustainability, which hopefully won't go by the wayside when we hit recessionary pressures as well, but that we realize that it's just as important, and there is some climate change going on somewhere, for sure. So I think, those are what we see as sort of the driving trends, and the macro and micro trends driving the clients that we work with, and shape the way they look at their markets.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of forces at play here. So much transformation that we're sort of on the brink of. So with all of that said, how are these organizations making money? How are they going to save money? I mean, you've each touched on it a little bit, but kind of in the grand scheme of things, what's the master plan? What's the right way to go? And then on top of that, how does open source play into that? Chetan, you want to?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I think it just depends on the country, what the competitive dynamics are in that country, and the journey of an operator, I think most boards and management teams understand that you have to manage the company short term and you have to manage the company medium to long term. I think in the short term, everybody is really focused on getting their 5G story out, get the network launched, get their mid-band deployment done, and that will kind of really power and give the revenues to invest in other areas. And so we are seeing across the board. I was in Brazil last week talking to the operators there, and they are just starting their 5G journey and starting kind of how to package for Soccer World Cup that's coming. F1. I attended the Sao Paulo F1. They were deeply involved in how do we kind of get people interested in F1 apps on their 5G devices and so on and so forth. So that is happening, kind of what we would expect. On the side, what's interesting is operators are already investing in private networks, edge computing with Mac, and service and vertical areas that are adjacent to what they know, like retail, logistics, and transportation, and so on and so forth. So all of that is happening. Now, the question is, when the consumer story kind of goes up and starts to come down, will you have enough firepower in the other areas that you are investing in to kind of negate any declines? And that story is not completely clear yet as to how it will pan out. For instance, like in Japan, even though they have been launching 5G and deploying 5G and millions of subscribers, the 4G ARPU is falling faster than 5G can kind of negate that decline. And so you will see bits and pieces of different strategy being in play. Having said that, Docomo has publicly said that by 2025, the access revenues will be less than 50% of our overall mix, meaning the rest of it coming from enterprise and B2C services. And so we are seeing that kind of mix of strategies in play depending on the region and the operator.
Okay. Will, is that in line with what you're seeing, or?
Absolutely. I'm glad Chetan touched on the private networking opportunity, because that's where I think open source can really sort of help drive the line, make that affordable within the enterprise, right? Because when you look at the average cost of what a mobile network operator spends to deploy a next generation network, just the hardware alone is north of 20 to 25 billion US dollars. So when you sort of look at, and there are multiple routes to market for private network, and I always get this question, as a service, on premise, Cisco offers as a service solution, as does HPE. I think Dell might get there eventually. Celona does something that's more of an on-premise, in kind of, total solution in the box there. And, this represents a tremendous, opportunity for even non-traditional players that haven't participated in this. But I do believe mobile network operators will have the ability to go in there and, and I'll cite T-Mobile because I spent time with them recently and we're in their backyard. They have a hybrid approach to that, where they're gonna offer, depending on the workload and the deployment scenario, either a slice of their public network or a combination of the two in a hybrid scenario. So that's really, really exciting. And I think the other thing that I think about with respect to how open source can really, drive monetization and affordability is when we look at spectrum auctions. And we look at C-band in the US and, $80+ billion for mid-band spectrum. Verizon had to shell out quite a bit of money to fill up, some of their gaps, AT&T to a lesser extent. At some point, unless the FCC gets, and I think there should be some way to cap this and not just collect all the money for the government coffers, but the mobile network operators, if they're spending billions of dollars on licensed spectrum, they've got to still spend the billions of dollars on the infrastructure, right? And where open source can really play a key role is lowering that capital expenditure line, right? So, those are just two things that I think about, with respect to how open source can really, drive the market, move the market, and help, help everyone, gain at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, so kind of touching on what you said about the hybrid approach and, taking different pieces from different areas and putting them together, that kind of makes me think about initiatives like the 5G Super Blueprint and the new Project Silva that are sort of reference implementations, reference frameworks. How do you see folks embracing that? Is that something that they're hungry for? Are we going to see broader collaboration between different aspects of companies using all of these different pieces of these projects, or is it going to be more of like a pick and choose model where they're picking from one project based on use cases, or more of kind of a holistic approach? What do you think, Roy?
Yeah, so I think so the blueprints exist for a reason, which is that there is a lot of open source out there, which is good,
Yep.
but which is bad, right? I mean, even within the Linux Foundation itself, which has become the biggest umbrella out there for open source initiatives, especially with regard to network and infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Even within, it's sort of hard to sort out what projects and what stage and how and who's backing it and which one's being sunset and which one's rising, and is it going to really rise, and is it dependent on this big carrier supporting it, or maybe the carrier withdraws support because someone resigned or retired, right? I mean, we've seen all that play out.
Yeah.
So I think the blueprints are a way around that to codify some level of expertise within a set of ecosystem partners that have come together, determine that they have relationships that should be established and are sustainable, and they've decided to come together to create a blueprint. And in the hopes that that blueprint is then replicated, because open source can lower costs, but integration costs, as Will was pointing out, integration costs will drive it up, right? I mean, there is cost to disaggregation, we understand that, right? And so the reality is that the blueprints are a way to reduce the costs, right? Anukat, right, formerly CNTT, right, plus the GSMA, plus the OPNFV, I think those were all in the right direction, and they were successful in terms of driving integration, driving a framework, driving validation, testing, right? I think that's important, because otherwise it's hard to consume projects one at a time unless you have in-house resources, expertise, and the money to spend, and you can show return on that investment, and that's not always the case. So I think blueprints are important. We're seeing the importance of that. I'm seeing blueprints across all the open source organizations being used as a way of, saying, look, if you want to build the Millennium Falcon for all these Lego parts, here's a little booklet, right? I mean, that's basically what it comes down to, because there's thousands of pieces, right? And someone's figured it out, so you just take it and replicate it. So I think replicability and the template is very important, and it's not unusual in open source, because we've all had that, the opinionated architecture by the leading architects that we all adhere to. It's like Kubernetes, or whatever it is, right? There's a way of doing things. Oh, that's brilliant. Let's just copy it, right? Or well-architected frameworks. It's just a continuation of that at a higher level. So I think that's important, and Project Silva is important. I think uniquely because of the European influence and the European needs specifically. Again, all the European operators, once they see how it can be consumed, and it builds on top of Endocat, thank goodness, not a new telco cloud, another one, right? I think that reusability is important. I think it's important in the open source community to not run out and create a new one or fork something just for the fun of it, but I think there is a sustainability element in the thought process to say, if it's not that different, come in. Don't fork it outside, because it's not good for you and it's not good for the community in the long term, right? So I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, what are some of the bigger barriers, though? I know security has been kind of top of mind. Is that one of the bigger barriers you're seeing? Is that something one of you want to address? Or are you seeing something that might be more of a challenge right now?
I think security, there's a perception amongst people that are not educated well enough on open source that when you disaggregate, you expand the threat surface, and inherently you introduce more risk into a network. But it's interesting. I've spent time recently with AT&T, Chris Sambar, and Gordon Mansfield, and we were talking about this. I actually wrote a Forbes article. I think Arpit likes to quote it occasionally. But actually, with open source, with having more eyes upstream and downstream, you actually have a more secure platform. And AT&T agrees with that wholeheartedly, and they're leaning very heavily into open source, to build out a good portion of their network. So I think it's more of a misperception that needs to be addressed by experts like my colleagues here on the panel. To continue to educate the market, that's not an issue. But
Yeah, I don't know, Chetan, what are you seeing?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and so kind of CTO is starting to plan out the next 2 to 5 years. One of the significant factors is the system integration costs, and the fear of the introduction of the unknowns. You have the knowns that you know about the existing vendors and probably other vendors that you're not engaged with.
Yeah.
But when you have these new elements added on top of a brand new infrastructure cycle, then I think operators generally tend to be more conservative about, unless there are economic pressures that they have to figure that out like right now. Otherwise, the system integration cost is a significant factor as to how, and the time delay, because these things surface as you go, as Dish has found out, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is, is the Rakuten model a better model, where you package things up in a way that it's less onerous on the operator, or you truly become plug and play, where we are not to the point where it is truly plug and play. There are a lot of system integration issues.
Yeah.
And so I think it'll depend on the embrace of what model works for what operator. I think they're trying out different things. Like maybe they will give Rakuten to the small market here, give Open RANs to one of the SIs here, give some to Mavenir, and figure out which one works better with their existing processes. And I think we'll reach to a point where it's no longer a question, just like it is not a question in IT.
Yeah, and I think, Jill, to answer your question, I think it's going to be a mix, right?
Yeah.
And I like to make a statement that choice drives innovation, choice drives competition, and so I think that's a good thing when you have different routes, different paths. That's a good thing. Now, saying that, and I think you touched on this. This is a new world order. This is a new ecosystem of participants. When we get back to the Open RAN subject, and there's goodness there because it helps, as Roy kind of touched on, domesticate the supply chain at least in this country for 5G. Even beyond the Ericssons and Nokias and Samsungs of the world. But at the end of the day. I believe it drives goodness, in general. It's just, it's going to take time to work its way out. What I love about the sort of the disaggregation of RAN and these new participants is that it leans very well into our core competency, at least in this country, around software, forward companies, and 5G inherently is a more software-defined standard than any other G before it. So the time is right. It'll take time to coalesce, but it's exciting to see what's transpiring.
Yeah, if we could add to that, I think, back to the security question, whether open's better or close is better, I think regardless, right, it's important. And I think, things like OpenSSF, right, Linux Foundation, I think it's critical because there's two elements of security. One is the CYA element, and the other one is real security, right? And both are equally important. I think that's just the reality. And when you buy from a proprietary vendor or you bring a GSI in, there's a CYA portion of it, and there is the real security, which is I'm outsourcing my security to someone who actually knows what they're doing, right? So, and there are economies of scale in terms of the vendor doing it for you on their behalf, so they have the expertise to do it because they can repeat that and sell it over and over again. Same with Rakuten. That's why they've invested in doing this Open RAN security guide, for instance, right? And there is incentive to do that. And as a carrier, you have to decide, do I have the expertise in-house? And, is my approach going to cover both the CYA element and the real security element, both of which are important to my career and the overall security of the carrier itself? And I think that's important, which is why OpenSSF and some of these initiatives are critical to say, if you take open source, we are standing behind it. The OpenSSL library you're taking now has been security vetted by the best in industry, and you can feel safe taking it. So I think those types of initiatives I expect to see more of, and hopefully the consumers of open source invest in the security element of it and vet it for everyone, for the community, right? That's the hope.
And I think there could be more working groups that are dedicated to security as well. I think that's been an early criticism of the ORAN Alliance that, on the surface, when you look at across all the working groups, it looks a little thin from a security standpoint. So, does that mean you're not really concerned or focused on security? So again, it's a perception that
Right.
needs to be addressed. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, speaking of taking different approaches and hybrid models, let's talk a little bit about the hybrid cloud. How are operators and cloud providers going to increase collaboration with open source? Are they going to increase collaboration with open source? Is that a model that they're moving to? Kind of touching on some of the other items that we've discussed today, is it still a driver? Is it for these folks? Is that something that you're seeing, or are you seeing pushback?
I think there is a significant the level of collaboration just went up a notch in the last 2 years. And so what some of the biggest operators are doing with the hyperscalers is not only running their kind of local or native application processes into the public cloud, but also kind of collaborating on how they run their RAN and core on a public cloud.
Yeah.
And further, how do you do a private networking and edge computing using the resources of hyperscalers, and where's the collaboration boundaries? I think from a technology front, tremendous progress. The question ultimately comes down to who owns the customer, and if we settle on a kind of a happy medium of how you approach developers, how you approach customers, large enterprises and deployments, I think we'll settle where people will do what they're really good at and collaborate on other pieces where they're might be competing, but it makes sense to bring them in. And so the collaboration level, I think, has gone up a notch.
Yeah, so are you seeing less people not being quite as rigid about working with competitors? I know in open source, we see that a lot.
I think the economic climate and the conditions of the ecosystem are forcing them to be much more open about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. There are lots of proof points that point to exactly what Jeetan was just saying. So, AT&T's decision to migrate its 5G core to Azure. Looking at, what Verizon has been doing, with AWS. And so, but there's always that, that balance, right? When you look at some of the aspirations that these hyperscalers have. But, at the end of the day, I fully believe that collaboration will continue. It just allows the mobile network operators to focus on their core competencies and do what they do really well. And AT&T has certainly had to make some course corrections recently with Warner and that sort of thing. I actually got to spend time with John Stankey in Evansville, Indiana, on a fiber tour, and it was really sort of eye-opening, to sort of hear how AT&T is focused on multiple partnerships to make sure that it delivers the best and most robust connectivity for its subscribers.
Yeah, I think we get calls from carriers asking if they should be worried about hyperscalers, and I make the point that hyperscalers don't really want their business, their core business, because the margins there aren't the best, and there's regulatory compliance, right? And so why would you take that on when in fact that the carrier could in fact be a nice customer for the cloud provider?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the reality. I got a call when AWS first announced private 5G. I got a call from a carrier that says, Roy, they're approaching us. Should we partner with them? I'm like, yeah, you don't have anything to lose, because they don't really care about the connectivity piece.
Right.
They're doing it to demonstrate to you that it is in fact doable to wake you up.
Yeah.
But what they really care about is if you look at the stack, any IoT stack, the monetization on top, the applications, the data, the storage of that is about 80, 90%. Connectivity is 5 to 10%.
Right.
They don't care about that piece. They care about 80, 90%, which
Yep.
they can eat, right? And that's what they care about. And so they want to enable you to reach out to those workloads, untether them, bring the data to them because they make the money. And if they can help you to do the connectivity piece, more economically, more, with more agility, you should approach them that way because it helped them, as Will said, it helps their business. And so the collaboration we are seeing, in fact, is, a telco is never monolithic, right? So from IT to core to transport to access to edge and on-premises, we're seeing collaboration. And the reality is all the large carriers will work with all the hyperscalers because that's the way the incentive model works, right? That's the reality, and that's the balance and checks and balances. But across every single one of those domains, there will be a hyperscaler telco collaboration, whether you're borrowing that backbone and using that, with Azure vWAN thing, with Cloud WAN, or whether on premises with the edge computing, whether it's Azure Stack or whether it's Outpost or Google, right? Distributed edge. I think the reality is you'll see the collaboration because it makes, as Will said, makes sense, right? Economic sense.
It does make sense.
It does make economic sense. Why not?
Yeah.
Now, what it means for the carrier is that you better be agile, better be innovative, better make sure you know what you're getting into so that you can monetize that stack on top. And as Chetan says, if you don't do that, you're done.
Right.
Or you get relegated to this little piece where you exist because the ecosystem and the regulatory compliance dictates that you exist. But your margins will never go up, and you're stuck there, and everyone else will just monetize around you as before, right? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, that's great. So just a couple more questions here. I know we've got about 5 more minutes left. So let's talk a little bit about data centers right now. I know that they're notorious for having terrible carbon footprints. So what's the role of open source in sustainability there, specifically with regards to operators and cloud providers?
Yeah, OS climate. Yeah. That's the answer, right? That's what you're looking for, right? OS climate. I think, when we put in context, data centers do consume a lot of power, right? But we have to look at the alternative, which is that if you were to distribute all those things, right, with lower PUEs across the board and doing computing across, everywhere else, and you weren't doing a shared model, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
So I think you have to put that in context.
Right.
But they are a big consumer of power and the like. But they have economies of scale. The advantage of economies of scale is that they can get better PUEs and they can do better, right, by investing in innovation about water use, right, about finding the most, I would say, carbon neutral source of electricity or power, right, and investing in the local infrastructure to do that. And we're seeing all the hyperscalers do that because they recognize the importance of sustainability and they recognize the importance of being able to have the customers to say, oh, look, your scope 2, scope 3 is great because you're using us, better than if you did it yourself, right? So it's a selling point. So I think, we're seeing that, and OS climate as a way of pulling together all that aggregate information and coordination, I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are you seeing, Chetan?
Yeah, sustainability is, again, one of those big topics that unless you dive into the details, you realize that, you're not measuring everything that impacts sustainability. And automation is key to sustainability. So you have to worry about the power consumption and all of that, but then there is a huge element end-to-end that involves humans, that involves software, services, components. You have to track everything, and unless you have embedded way of measuring, you will never be able to really truly understand how you are impacting environment.
That's a good point.
And so we have to get the sustainability elements into the standardization process so it's transparent to everybody, from procurement to delivery of YouTube on your phone. I think we have to, as an industry, we have to kind of go up a notch in terms of how we really understand and react to sustainability issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so just a couple more minutes left. Let's shift gears here and bring up a very hot topic, the metaverse. So is it science fiction? Is it reality? Are we seeing roadmaps? Are we actually going to get there? It's all the talk right now is up here, but what does that look like? Is that something that we're going to see sort of proliferated all throughout what we're doing? Is our next One Summit going to be everyone with headsets on at home? Or are we going to see it with very specific use cases like medical and industrial?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. The metaverse is a pretty esoteric concept, right? It reminds me of, the Sims, game from that my kids played years ago. But if you step back for a moment and you look what is the metaverse all about? It's about mixed reality, and there are definitely practical applications with mixed reality. I mean, there's a company, Tactile, that I'm going to mention T-Mobile again because we're in their backyard, and I was just at their analyst event. They're leveraging augmented reality for field service applications to more quickly diagnose and troubleshoot, reduce truck rolls and that sort of thing. That definitely has a carbon offset to it right there. And I think the other big opportunity for the metaverse is, again, it gets back to digital twin, and the capabilities there to be able to, build, test, let's say telecom networks before they're actually deployed, debug them, that sort of thing. So I think if we step back for a moment, and it's the bright shiny object right now, obviously, but really if you look at mixed reality, I think what 5G is going to do in particular is really provide a platform for mixed reality and augmented reality in particular solutions that are really going to transform the way the enterprises manage their operations, whether it's in the field or it's within a manufacturing facility. So that's my big take on the shiny object of the hour. Roy, what do you think?
You got 30 seconds, Roy.
Yeah, and I think the metaverse is again, it's a concept. It's part of it's fiction. It's going to be fiction for a little while, but the elements I think that we'll talk about, mixed reality, extended reality, do have real implications for industrial use cases and for entertainment and the like, and with Roblox and all that. My only call to action would be let's not make that in place of real reality. Let's keep the meetings, in person, physical, and the like,
So
and
no
not make
VR
that go away.
headset next time.
Preferably not. Only for, specific entertainment is fine, but let's meet in person, because I think that isolation layer creates disaggregated communities, and that I don't think is good for the world. I think connecting the world physically, I think is a lot more important. So metaverse should be used as a tool for that, for helping society, not disaggregating it, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts from you, Chetan?
So I will just give you two quick points. 2019, we did a VR, kind of the world's first VR surgery demo. So it's real. That stuff is in FDA approval now. But then people conflate, a lot of this VR stuff will flow on 5G. So I can tell you that 5G macro network is not ready for kind of the VR surgery or VR streaming. It'll be probably 2025 before we even get closer, because the macro networks are not designed, the edge network is not designed for metaverse type of application. It doesn't mean it cannot be done. It can be done in millimeter wave, or AR applications can be done on existing networks of 5G. And so I think you have to really hone down on use cases, a region, operator, and then some things are real. You cannot just say metaverse will work in 5G everywhere.
Yeah,
Good.
very good.
Yeah, because 5G, it's not a light switch, it's a journey, right? And so you've got there are lots of factors. There's, to your point, mid-band spectrum build out. There's the progression of non-standalone to standalone as well. And so, it's going to take a while to get there. So.
Wi-Fi and fiber first. That's reality. I mean, what you try to say.
Yeah.
If metaverse apps exist, they run on Wi-Fi today and fiber, not 5G yet.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you, gentlemen. This was a great discussion.
Thank you, Jill. It's a pleasure.
And we'll
Thank
hand it
you.
off to Arpit to introduce our next
Thank you, Jill.
discussion.
Thank you, Jill.